My name is Imad Harb. I am the Director of Research and Analysis at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Last Friday, Iran elected a new president to replace the late Ibrahim Raisi. The new president is reformist Masoud Pezeshkian, a doctor, not a cleric this time, who garnered the support of some 54% of the electorate in a runoff against conservative Saeed Jalili. Turnout was just under 50%. To discuss the Iranian election and potential future developments regarding domestic and foreign policies, I am joined by Dr. Daniel Brumberg, who is a non-resident senior fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and Director of Democracy and Governance Studies at Georgetown University. Hi, Dan.
Good morning.
Joining me. First, to boil down a very, very complicated issue, what is your general take on this election of a reformist to be Iran's president?
Well, it's an election that was a consequence of something that was unexpected, and that was the sudden death of the former President Raisi in a helicopter crash back in May, which really shook up the whole political terrain, because suddenly an election for the president of Iran, which wasn't going to happen for quite some time, was on the agenda, had to be scheduled, and had to be scheduled quickly. I think that the results, which you just summarized, which represent a pretty significant victory for the reformist sort of camp, such as it is important, because it signals that a significant part of the voting Iranian population and the participation from the first round in June to the recent round went up about 10% to 50%, signifies a clear rejection of the hardline politics and an effort of reformists under very difficult conditions to reassert their influence in the Iranian political system.
Right. Well, knowing that the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, is really the ultimate arbiter of politics and everything in the country, how much wiggle room, how much freedom of action does this new president have?
Well, this is a great question. It's the $64 million question. I think he has limited room for many reasons, one of which is the Supreme Leader himself, who during the recent campaign hinted that he preferred Jalili. He didn't say it explicitly, that would have been a mistake, but he certainly hinted that he did. He preferred a revolutionary leader, as he put it. And Khamenei is the Supreme Leader, and he has the ultimate say in the political system. You have a parliament dominated by hardliners. And most importantly, you have in the last year a reassertion, not a reassertion, that's not accurate. I would say in the last year and a half, 2 years, you see the hardliners really asserting their power very significantly in anticipation of a fight over who will inherit this position of Supreme Leader, which is certainly going to come down in the next few years. So there's a lot at stake, and it seemed that the hardliners are setting the stage for this fight, and that's what makes this particular outcome quite surprising, because it really will, in some sense, complicate this struggle over who's going to inherit the mantle from the Supreme Leader. So it is an interesting and somewhat perhaps even paradoxical development.
Yeah, it is paradoxical development. It really points to a certain something that, is the Iranian election really a free election? I mean, it's really a very, very important question that, everybody expected a hardliner, a conservative at least, to win the election with Khamenei's position known as it is. I mean, apparently, this went to the voters actually, and they elected the reformist one.
Well, I mean, of course, the election was carefully vetted, and other potential candidates were ruled out by the so-called Guardian Council. So, of course, it's not an open and free election in the sense that we think about it in the West, but it is an election under the umbrella of an authoritarian regime, which has a certain element of competitiveness. And I ought to point out that in the 2021 election, previous presidential election, that Raisi won, all reformists were excluded. So one of the big questions to think about now is why it was that even Khamenei, with certain misgivings about a reformist candidate, didn't get in the way, right? And allowed us to move forward. And it's possible, and we can only speculate, that given the isolation of the government, the protests over the last 2 years that erupted in the after the killing of Masha Amini,
Right.
who was a young woman who was beaten to death by the so-called morality police,
Right. Yeah.
or really the immorality police.
Right.
And so you certainly didn't expect that Khamenei would not get in the way, but he may have decided that it's better off having a centrist. We call the new elected president-elect, a reformist, and he is a credible reformist with a credible reformist background, but he's also a centrist who tried to appeal to conservative voters. And I think if you look at the first round of election, during which the Speaker of the Parliament, Kalibaf, got about 3 million plus votes, many of those votes probably went to the president-elect. So that's interesting. It may signify that, from the point of view of the supreme leader, maybe he felt that having somebody in there who's not going to completely alienate young people or a lot of young people would make sense.
Besides, I mean, there is that element of Khamenei is quite sure and quite certain that he and people in the regime like him are in control of the situation. So why not have somebody who we can, whose wings we can clip anytime we want to, right? I mean, isn't that what happened with Hassan Rouhani and Mohammad Khatami?
Yeah, that is true. I mean, Khatami represented a kind of, when he was elected in '97 and then reelected, he represented a kind of philosopher king. He was an intellectual, part of the reformists, the Islamic left, and he really did threaten his politics, although they were not revolutionary, did threaten the hardliners, and eventually came down against him and his allies. And the same with Rouhani. And it's likely that the Pezeshkian will now face, the president-elect, significant opposition from hardliners, especially within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, the leader of which, by the way, welcomed his election. So there's been a lot of positive signals, so-called positive signals, from the hardliners, including Khamenei himself, who affirmed the election and said, this is the president. But he will be highly constrained, not only by the internal politics of Iran, but also by the regional and global politics, which we can talk about as a separate item, if you like.
Yeah, we will in a minute. But he probably also I mean the president-elect also knew that he really has to tread lightly. And one of his first speeches after being elected, he really paid homage to the supreme leader and to the revolution and this and that. So I think he knows how to walk the line, so to speak, knowing that he can be clipped, his wings can be clipped very, very early.
Well, you're right. It's a fine line, but let's not forget that during the campaign and prior to that, Pezeshkian really denounced the repression of the women's freedom movement.
That's correct.
Was quite explicit in saying that we cannot impose a hijab. This is a personal decision. He took the reformist position very strongly on that. As a former minister of health, acting and then minister of health, he was in the Khatami government, had a considerable political experience, was then elected 5 times and reelected as a member of parliament from Tabriz. He comes from a Naziri Kurdish background. So when he speaks and he condemns the repression of the women's movement and says that the wearing of hijab has to be a personal choice and not coerced, he's really getting at a fundamental premise of the Islamic Republic, which is, yes, we can coerce this, and we have a right to tell women what to do, and he's rejecting this. That is a position which suggests that he's serious. The problem is that he doesn't have much room for maneuver, and if he tries to maneuver too quickly to move from that position to some sort of politics, he's going to find himself antagonizing the hardliners.
Correct. Yeah.
So that's very tricky. But I think what he will try to do as best as he can, and this is a kind of echo of what the reformers have tried to do,
Right.
is push for some decompression of the political arena, some backing off of the state from the kind of repressive politics it's pursued. And that's about perhaps the best he can do beyond his position on economic reform and
Right.
dealing with the whole economy. And he's actually an advocate of a free economy approach, which his primary opponent Jalili isn't and wasn't. So for the president-elect, the economy is going to be really the critical factor, and that's why, of course, he's advocated for a position of returning Iran to negotiations on the nuclear deal and so on, because he wants sanctions to be removed. I might add here that there was his closest running mate, as it were, was Javad Zarif, the former foreign minister and advocate of the reformist position. It's reported that Pezeshkian and Zarif went to the poll together and voted together at a girls' school in Western Tehran, whereas Jalili voted in a mosque, right? So the symbolism of the two, Zarif and Pezeshkian going to vote together, as it were, or at least being the
the symbolism.
It's potent. It's interesting. Yeah.
I mean, you alluded to the economic situation. I was going to ask you about the economy because the initial response of for the exchange rate, the real to the U.S. dollar, and for the stock market were rather positive. I mean, the very first day, yesterday, I think Saturday, they really posted some really good numbers. So apparently the economic class, if you will, is happy with this, considering that he is really talking about trying to mend fences with the West, open up the economy, see what Iran can do with its oil industry and all that stuff. So
right.
Yeah, I think he's on his way to doing that, considering if the supreme leader really gives up a little bit on the so-called revolutionary economy, right?
Well, Jalili is his opponent. Pezeshkian's opponent is an advocate of the siege of the resistance economy.
Right.
Pezeshkian and Zarif are advocates of international engagement and reducing sanctions as a way of reviving and strengthening the private sector. They're very different positions of these two candidates, and they have very different implications for Iran's internal politics. But there's a contradiction that the president-elect now in Iran will have to face, and that is he said he wants to remove subsidies, and that kind of policy, kind of a liberalization policy, could hurt some of the voters who voted for Pezeshkian, because they will be paying the price literally for any effort to sort of reduce subsidies. So there's a certain contradiction. There was clearly in the vote for Pezeshkian was a kind of was a rejection, a negative vote, a protest vote against the hardliners. That doesn't translate into a coherent alliance. We're having elections in France today, so I'm thinking of the same problem there. It doesn't suggest a coherent alliance for the president-elect in terms of the economic front. So there's a lot to work out for him. And as you say, his hands are tied. But if he would, for example, mobilize support in the parliament for certain liberalization measures, reduction of subsidies, and it didn't work, the supreme leader could always blame the president-elect, as he in fact often blamed the former president for his so-called weakness on the economy. So that too plays into the hands of the supreme leader.
Besides, I mean, you also have the reserved powers of the IRGC, and how and its role in the economy. I mean, I don't.
Well, there's an enormous amount of terrain reserved for the Revolutionary Guard. There's a lot at stake in terms of a economic liberalization strategy that might impinge on their position. The Revolutionary Guard have manipulated and leveraged sanctions to their favor, because sanctions really give them much more leverage in the economy. Taking away sanctions would somewhat mitigate that leverage. So there's a lot of good, aside from ideology, right, which is not in, which is an important issue. There is economic interests which are at stake, and any effort by the president-elect to move in a decisive way to affect those interests could really create a backlash from the hardliners.
Moving on a little bit to foreign policy issues. I mean, we have a war in Gaza. We have a potential war in Lebanon, and Iran is at least perceived to be very, very involved in both of these fronts, including also the Houthis in Yemen and the pro-Iran Shia groups in Iraq. So how much leverage will he have, will the new president have, on issues of this nature, on the potential for these militias to be really basically, you know, corralled, so to speak, for the lack of another term, to really toe a more moderate line regarding Israel, regarding the war with Israel and things of that nature?
Well, if I would say that it has to be remembered, first of all, and I've argued this in work that I've done for the Arab Center, that Iran was surprised by the outbreak of the Gaza war and wasn't necessarily prepared for it. They may have provided assistance that enabled Hamas to undertake the attack in October, but they weren't prepared for the kind of conflagration or potential regional explosion that such an attack eventually could create or might create. So Iran had to adjust very quickly, both in Lebanon and in Gaza, and of course openly to support both Hezbollah and Hamas. At the same time, Iran moved very carefully, and we're not going to go over the history of the recent struggles and fighting between Israel and Hezbollah, and Israel and Iran in a direct sort of way. But both countries, Iran and Israel, have just tried to stand back from a form of escalation which would lead to a regional war. And I think that's going to continue to be Iran's position under the new president, because Iran's not looking for a regional war, particularly in the context of the struggle to come over the supreme leader. Having said that, and the recent sort of efforts to revive the negotiations on a ceasefire may be going somewhere finally. We've counted on it or expected it or hoped for it many times, and it hasn't come to fruition. Yeah. But Hamas is adjusting its position on the question of this three-stage ceasefire agreement, probably because Israel is not prevailing in the way that it thought it would in terms of its goal of destroying Hamas's military capability. And there is a lot of talk now in Israel about a kind of deal that, from the perspective of Israel's own hardliners, would be a kind of capitulation, but the military is saying that we're stretched too thin, we need an agreement, we have to deal with Hezbollah in the north. And I'm not saying this would necessarily lead to a war, but we need a breather, as it were, and we can't prevail against Hamas, and we'll have to, under some circumstances, deal with a political situation in which Hamas somehow still exists, right, as a political and even military force. This plays into Iran's hands in many ways. And so I don't see that it may be with the new president that Iran will be able to back some sort of ceasefire in effect. And that would be acceptable to Iran's own hardliners. I don't think the new president will change Iran's defiant position on Israel. The reformist position on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has always been that, and this is what Khatami himself stated openly, that Iran would accept anything that the Palestinians would accept, which was an ambiguous position, but opened the possibility for Iran to support a two-state solution in effect, or at least not oppose it. And that may or may not be the position of the new president, but he's going to want to be very careful about re-articulating that Khatami line right now, because during the Gaza war, the former foreign minister of Iran, who was killed also in the helicopter crash, basically said that, well, we'll agree to anything that that undoes what happened in 1948, right? Which is not a position that is going to lead to any negotiations. And so we're not going to probably see movement on that, but we could see Iran sort of demonstrating some sort of tactical flexibility on both on Lebanon and on Gaza.
Right. Just the reverse of this. What do you think the militias, the Iran-friendly militias in Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, are thinking right now?
I don't think they're too worried about the election of the new president. I think that they look at Pezeshkian as somebody who's already stated that he's a friend of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, and he's been, although he's called for constructive relations with the West, he's said pretty defiant things about the United States. Right. And I think those militias don't have much to worry about. The key issue is whether there's a ceasefire in Gaza. Once there's a ceasefire, I think almost all the militias, maybe not the Houthis, they're a particular case, sure, but all the other militias will stand back. And the critical one here is in the case of Lebanon, because there's been real concern that Hezbollah and Iran are moving towards a full-scale war. So a lot is going to hinge on whether the United States in particular can push both Hamas and Bibi Netanyahu, as it were, to right, reach a ceasefire.
Just regionally, we're talking right across the water from Iran. We have Arabian Peninsula. We have quite a few previously nervous, now very cautionary states regarding Iran. What do you think Iran's relations with them? I personally speculate that the goodwill gestures and the openness on better relations is going to continue under the new president.
Yeah, I mean, the Iranian position is basically to keep all options open, which is a smart position. And the reconciliation with Saudi Arabia, which was birthed, as it were, by the Chinese, all those policies will be continued. One of the open questions, as I was alluding to before, is if there's a ceasefire and most of Iran's allies in the region stand back, most importantly Hezbollah, the Houthis may not fall into line because they are, well, one of the problems with Houthis is they really don't represent a government in the same sense that Hezbollah is part of a government, so they're not tethered to that, so those constraints, and that is a problem in among other places in the Red Sea, of course, itself. So Iran's Arab neighbors in the Gulf will be looking to Iran to restrain the Houthis, but it's not necessarily the case that Iran will be able to do so. So it's going to be a complicated picture.
Right. Well, finally, the United States. We're talking about the GCPOA. So far, since 2018, when Donald Trump abrogated the treaty, or rather, not the treaty, the agreement, withdrew from the agreement, and now President Biden did not necessarily really succeed in reviving it, and negotiations supposedly are on, but nobody really knows what's going on. We are expecting that the new president would pursue that avenue. He's going to try to negotiate about that. What do you think are the chances, considering that we don't know really what's going to happen in November?
If the new president appoints Zarif as foreign minister, that would be an indication of where he might want to go. Zarif has been such a presence, and during there was a very vociferous exchange of views between Jalili and Pezeshkian during the presidential campaign, TV debates, and the president-elect condemned Iran's foreign policy in the sense of he didn't condemn it, that's too strong a word, but he assailed a politics that had prevented the effort to find some sort of compromise on reviving the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement. He demanded or advocated for a policy that would allow for the removal of sanctions. So that's and the foreign policy issues were up front in those debates, which is quite remarkable. And now the question is what to do. And I think that aside from the fact that the hardliners will not be keen to go back to an agreement that the United States unilaterally abandoned, for Iran, they're looking at the U.S. presidential arena, a weakened Biden, the possibility that, of course, former President Trump will be reelected. And if Trump is reelected, any notion of going back to any kind of agreement or reviving it will be simply will be impossible. And it's very unlikely that Iran, with a weakened, in the context of the presidential campaign in the United States and a weakened president, that Iran will have an opening or will seek an opening to pursue negotiations, nor would Biden risk the backlash that he would certainly encounter by trying to go back to a serious negotiation. So I think that even if Javad Zarif is appointed foreign minister, which I think is pretty unlikely, but who knows? Iran's politics produces surprises, as we have seen.
Right.
It's unlikely that there will be room on that particular issue to negotiate. If Biden wins or Biden steps aside and another Democrat is nominated and wins, then it's a very different ballgame. Right. I would note on this issue, by the way, that already the State Department has issued a very lukewarm statement about the election in Iran. I think that my sense is that it was not the kind of statement that will be helpful. The United States has demonstrated a pretty bad track record in terms of understanding the potential significance of reformists returning to the political fold and adopting a position that would, in effect, not hurt them. Let me put it that way. I think that we could have had a somewhat more positive statement. We'll see what happens. But that issue aside, I think the room for maneuver on returning to a nuclear agreement will be quite limited.
Right. Well, I think we covered many of the issues that we could cover. I truly appreciate you joining me this morning, and thank you very much for this very nice discussion. I appreciate it, and you put the Iranian new elections on the map, like they say in analysis. So thank you very much. We truly appreciate it. Thank you.